Well, I've been cleaning up my office and came across a paper I wrote in February 1969. It would be shortly after Merton's death. And it's, I thought it, when I read it, it hadn't been published, but it has been. It was in a collection edited by Patrick Hart, Brother Patrick. Some reminiscences of Thomas Merton. These comments are personal reflections of a monk, on a monk who lived among us and does so no longer, only in spirit. More about what kind of man he was to live with, how we saw him, more than a study of any ambitious length. Even at that, they were at one man's view. And that monk in the Abbey only 9 years with Father Lewis. But I did have him as novice master, worked with him, knew him fairly well, and thought of him as I still do as a friend. Further, it is only with some fear that I put these thoughts down, for he was deep, complex, very holy man, many-sided. Besides, it's too soon, hardly cold in his grave. But taken for what they are, these are musings of a man lately among us and may be of interest. You could tell him by his walk. He had a rather rapid walk, not altogether measured and orderly. For one thing, his feet were spread out fan fashion, and there was something sad in his gait. Vigorous walk, except when he was reading, which he often did. Small hands and feet. He was hard on shoes. Had a fine torso with strong shoulders and back. His legs seemed somewhat short, and they made him look smaller than he was. Clothes didn't suit him well. He never looked neat and spruce, though in his monk's habit he was presentable enough. Things hung on him, looked baggy and shapeless. Even when dressed in civilian clothes, he didn't look sharp. He looked a bit disordered and disorganized. Didn't care much about clothes. That was obvious. In the years he's living in his hermitage, he would appear at the monastery for dinner as for some appointments in some odd combination of work clothes, generally with a nut-to-shake case for his mail or books, and a bag of groceries to take back to the hill. If you stopped to talk to him for a moment, he was glad enough to do so. Awake, interested, looked at you closely with bright eyes. He had a rather plain face, but his eyes were full of life and full of merriment. His voice was quiet. His laugh was gentle and deep, like a chuckle. He had a way of sensing when something was over, and he would end the matter there. This was a real characteristic of him. He loathed dragging things out beyond their measure. When something was finished, he was ready for the next assignment. When I was a novice, I recall that in periods of spiritual direction, he always seemed to know before I did when the matter was over. It always seemed to me an ending rather abrupt, but when I thought on it later, it was simply that he grasped quickly that the situation had reached a point of terminus. In meetings of the Abbot's Council or the building committee or any such group, he was often ill at ease because they went sometimes dragged on, windy and long drawn-out discussions which bored him and exasperated him. Windy, drawn-out discussions were not his thing. If there was no more to be said, he was off. Visitors and callers who had nothing more than small talk got short shrift from him. But he was always courteous and kind to anyone who had a need. He wasn't hasty or restless, but he knew how to get off the phone. hated to waste time, had great reverence for time, sort of a sacrament for him. Always totally immersed in what he did. He never played at anything. In his work, he was systematic, followed regular procedures. He had his work well organized, as we say. I recall again from my novitiate days that he would assign our work in the morning after chapter, and then go upstairs to his office and his writing. Once in a while, there'd be some question would come up about the work before we got started, so somebody had to go up and ask him. And he was generally very short and even curt. He did not like being bothered once he was into his work. And he didn't mind insisting that such courtesy toward others, leaving them in peace and undisturbed, was a normal thing for a good monk. You didn't do that to people. I often helped him typing manuscripts or answering mail. It's a difficult job. I couldn't read his writing. And you didn't like to bother him because you knew if he did, he wouldn't like it either. And in his manuscripts, he was very consistent. Typed the first draft, then he would go over it by hand in blue ink, blue pen, making corrections. Then he would go over it again the third time with a black pen, make more corrections or additions. Then have someone type it on a stencil, usually a novice. Then he'd mail that to his friends, and then he'd get feedback on that. Then he would rewrite the whole thing and then submit it to a magazine. Then it would be published and more feedback. Then that would be corrected and refined, and then finally it would show up with a bunch of others in a book. It became a kind of pattern he had. He had a sense of being aware that he was somewhat isolated, and he didn't want to make some obvious blunder. The vast amount of material that's never been published, we still have it. They're working on it. He had system. He had plans on what he did and what things he would do during the day, what type of reading he would do and when. He liked to save steps and time on his way to church, to choir. He'd mail his letters or check the bulletin board or pick up a pair of shoestrings or get some razor blades. But he did it easily, without tension. Good at keeping appointments. He had an air of dispatch in what he did. Generally was thorough, but sometimes he was rather hasty. Had fine insights into people. Good judge of character. Sometimes blundered in his interviews with postulants, but overall his perception was above average. And he could be open to discussion, see your view too. But once he had his mind made up, he was hard to change.